The day my father passed away was supposed to be about grief. That's what losing a parent should be: grief, memories, and finding ways to honor their life. Instead, for me, it became the beginning of betrayal, deception, and an anger I didn't know I was capable of feeling. Dad had been my anchor, the one person who made me feel safe in a world that often felt chaotic. Even in his final years, as cancer chipped away at his body, he remained the same steadfast man who raised me. He didn't complain, didn't ask for sympathy, he just fought. And when he couldn't fight anymore, he called me to his bedside and made me a promise. "You'll be okay, Jenny," he said weakly, his hand trembling in mine. I made sure of it. "You'll always have something to fall back on." At the time, I didn't think much of it. I was too focused on keeping it together, on staying strong for him, even as my heart shattered into a million pieces. I didn't want to think about money or safety nets, I just wanted him to stay. But life doesn't work that way. A week later, I stood in a sea of black at his funeral, watching as they lowered him into the ground. My siblings, Leah and Ben, flanked me on either side, both of them crying. For a moment, I thought we'd finally be united in our grief, that we'd lean on each other to get through this. That moment didn't last long. It was Leah who started it. Just 2 days after the funeral, she called me out of the blue, her voice tight but fake, like she was trying too hard to sound composed. "Hey, Jenny," she said. "So, Ben and I went to Dad's lawyer today. We wanted to get everything squared away, so we can move forward." I blinked, caught off guard. "Already? Don't you think it's a bit soon?" Leah laughed lightly, the way she always did when she was trying to dismiss someone's concerns. "Oh, come on, Jen. It's not like we're rushing to sell the house or anything. We just wanted to make sure the bills are covered. You know how these things can pile up." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Okay. So, what did the lawyer say?" Her pause was barely noticeable, but I caught it. "Well," she began slowly, "it turns out there's not much left. Between the medical bills and everything else, most of Dad's savings are gone." I frowned. That didn't make sense. Dad was careful with his money, almost obsessively so. He'd been saving for decades, planning for every contingency. There was no way his entire estate had been wiped out in just a few years. "What about the house?" I asked. Leah hesitated again, this time longer. "The house is still there, obviously," she said. "But Ben and I were thinking, since you already have your apartment, it might make sense for us to, split it between us. You don't really need it, right?" I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. "Are you serious? The house is supposed to be split 3 ways. Dad told me himself." "Yeah, well," Leah said, her voice hardening, "things change. It's not like you contributed much in his last years anyway. Ben and I handled most of it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had spent every weekend at Dad's side, running errands, cooking his meals, helping him when he was too weak to get out of bed. Leah and Ben, on the other hand, had barely shown up unless it was convenient for them. Leah had her busy schedule as a yoga instructor, and Ben had his high-powered corporate job that apparently couldn't spare him a single Saturday. I opened my mouth to argue, but Leah cut me off. "Look, Jenny, I don't want this to turn into a fight. We're family, okay? Just, let me and Ben handle this. We'll make sure you're taken care of." Before I could respond, she hung up. I tried to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they really believed what they were saying, that they had somehow earned a larger share of Dad's estate because they thought their contributions were more significant than mine. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Dad had been clear about his intentions. He wanted everything split equally between the 3 of us. He had even mentioned setting aside something extra for me, a safety net, he called it. So where was it? And why were Leah and Ben acting like they were doing me a favor by including me at all? The next day, I called the lawyer myself. He seemed surprised to hear from me, which only confirmed my suspicions. "Oh, Jenny," he stammered. "I wasn't aware you'd be involved in this process." I gritted my teeth. Why wouldn't I be? I'm his daughter, aren't I? "Of course," he said quickly. "It's just, your siblings led me to believe they were handling everything." "Yeah, I'm sure they did," I muttered. "Listen, I just want a copy of the will. Can you send it to me?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I'm afraid I can't do that without your siblings' consent. They're the executors of the estate." My stomach sank. What? Why? Dad never said anything about that. "I'm sorry, Jenny," the lawyer said, his tone sympathetic but firm. "That's just how it was set up." I hung up, feeling a mix of frustration and helplessness. My own father's estate was being kept from me, and there was nothing I could do about it, at least, not yet. I decided to confront Leah and Ben directly. I showed up at Leah's house unannounced, catching her off guard. She opened the door in her usual polished way, her blonde hair perfectly styled and her yoga leggings looking like they'd never seen an actual workout. "Jenny," she said, her smile thin. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," I said, stepping past her before she could invite me in. Leah sighed, closing the door behind me. "If this is about the inheritance, I already told you." "I want to see the will," I interrupted. She froze, just for a second, before recovering. "Why? Don't you trust us?" I let out a bitter laugh. "No, Leah, I don't. And I'm starting to think I have a pretty good reason not to." Her face darkened. "You're being ridiculous. Ben and I are doing what's best for everyone. You should be grateful we're even considering your feelings." "Grateful?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You're trying to cut me out of my own father's estate and you want me to be grateful?" She crossed her arms, her expression icy. "Maybe if you'd done more for Dad when he was alive, you wouldn't feel so guilty now." That was it. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just a misunderstanding or a difference of opinion. This was calculated. Leah and Ben weren't just trying to take more than their fair share, they were trying to take everything. I left without another word, my hands shaking with anger. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. But first, I needed proof. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Leah's smug face and heard her condescending voice telling me to be grateful. The audacity of it churned in my stomach like acid. I couldn't let it go, not now. Not when I knew deep down that Dad's wishes had been twisted into something unrecognizable. I didn't know where to start. Leah and Ben had made sure I was boxed out of the official channels, but they didn't know me as well as they thought. I wasn't just the baby of the family, the one who went along with whatever they decided. I'd grown up under their shadow, always feeling smaller, quieter, less important. But this time, I was going to show them who I really was. I started digging. The first place I looked was Dad's house, or what used to be Dad's house, before Leah and Ben had unofficially decided it was theirs. The place was quiet when I arrived, the smell of his cologne still faint in the air. It hurt to be there, to see the photos on the wall and his favorite chair by the window, but I pushed the emotions aside. I wasn't here to mourn. I was here to uncover the truth. I spent hours going through his things. His desk drawers were neat but almost too neat, like someone had already sifted through them. Most of the important documents were gone, bank statements, investment records, anything that might show where his money had gone. But then I remembered something. Dad had a habit of hiding things in odd places. When we were kids, he used to stash money in old coffee cans and tuck them away in the back of the pantry. "You never know when you'll need a little extra," he'd say with a wink. I went to his bedroom closet and started pulling down boxes. Most of them held nothing but old clothes and knickknacks, but in the very back, behind a pile of worn-out shoes, I found a shoebox. It was taped shut, the kind of thing Leah and Ben wouldn't have bothered with. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside, I found a stack of papers, letters, handwritten notes, and what looked like an inventory of his assets. It was dated 2 years ago, and my heart raced as I scanned the list. The house, his savings, and his retirement fund were all there, marked to be divided equally between me, Leah, and Ben. But there was something else. A fourth account. I didn't recognize the name of the account. It was listed under some kind of investment portfolio, but next to it, Dad had written, "For Jenny's future. To live her dreams." Tears filled my eyes as I read those words. Dad hadn't just thought of me, he'd planned for me, made sure I'd have something to build a life with. But where was this account now? And why hadn't Leah or Ben mentioned it? I knew I couldn't confront them until I had more information. If they'd gone this far to hide the truth, they wouldn't just admit to stealing from me. I needed hard evidence, something I could use to expose them. The next step was finding the lawyer who had drafted Dad's will. The one Leah and Ben had met with after the funeral. His name was Mr. Harris, and he worked for a small firm in town. I made an appointment under the pretense of having questions about my father's estate. When I walked into his office, he looked surprised to see me. He was a thin, nervous man with round glasses that kept slipping down his nose. "Miss Parker," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "How can I help you today?" "I need a copy of my father's will," I said bluntly. Mr. Harris adjusted his glasses, his face paling. I'm afraid I can't provide that without the consent of the executors." "And who are the executors?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Your siblings, Leah and Ben," he said reluctantly. I leaned forward, narrowing my eyes. "Mr. Harris, I'm not here to play games. I know something isn't right. My father left behind an investment account that was meant for me. Can you tell me what happened to it?" His hands fidgeted with a pen on his desk. "I'm sorry, Miss Parker, but I'm bound by confidentiality." "Confidentiality?" I repeated, my voice rising. "They're stealing from me. My father trusted you to handle his estate, and you're letting them get away with it." Mr. Harris looked genuinely uncomfortable, but he didn't budge. "If you have concerns, I suggest you speak with your siblings directly. Or you could take legal action, though I'm sure it won't come to that." I stood up, my frustration boiling over. It already has. As I left his office, I felt more determined than ever. Leah and Ben weren't just being greedy, they were actively covering their tracks. But if they thought I was going to back down, they were wrong. That night, I decided to track the money myself. I knew it was a long shot, I didn't have access to their accounts, and I wasn't exactly an expert in financial forensics. But I had one advantage they didn't know about: Dad's habits. He wasn't the type to switch banks or shuffle his money around. He liked consistency, which meant there was a good chance his accounts were still in the same place they'd always been. I logged into his old online banking account, the one I used to help him with when he wasn't feeling well. The password hadn't been changed. At first, I didn't find much. His checking account was empty, and his savings had been drained, probably to pay for the medical bills, just like Leah had said. But then I checked the investment portfolio, the one listed in the note I'd found. It was gone. Not just empty, closed. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The account had been closed just a week before Dad's death, and the funds, nearly $150,000, had been transferred to an account I didn't recognize. The name on the receiving account? Ben Parker. My hands shook as I took a screenshot of the transaction. This was it. Proof. Leah and Ben hadn't just taken more than their share, they had stolen outright. But I wasn't done yet. I needed to know exactly how far they'd gone. The next day, I paid a visit to an old friend. Mark was a tech-savvy guy I'd known since college, someone who had a knack for finding information most people couldn't. He worked in cybersecurity now, but I knew he still dabbled in less-than-legal activities when the situation called for it. "Jenny Parker," he said with a grin when he saw me. "Long time, no see. What brings you to my lair?" "I need your help," I said, cutting to the chase. "It's a family matter." His grin faded as I explained the situation. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, letting out a low whistle. "Damn," he said. "Your siblings sound like real pieces of work. Can you help me?" I asked. Mark nodded. "Yeah, I can track the money for you. But if they're smart, they'll have moved it around a lot to cover their tracks. It might take some time." "I don't care how long it takes," I said. "Just find it." As I left Mark's apartment, I felt a flicker of hope. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had the upper hand. Leah and Ben thought they'd won, that they'd outsmarted me. But they underestimated just how far I was willing to go. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The days that followed were a blur of determination and rage. I was running on pure adrenaline, each new discovery pulling me deeper into the tangled web of lies Leah and Ben had spun. Mark worked quickly, sending me updates whenever he uncovered something significant. Every time my phone buzzed with a new message, my heart raced. The first real breakthrough came 3 days after I'd visited him. Mark had managed to track the $150,000 from the investment account Dad had left for me. It hadn't stayed in Ben's account for long. He'd transferred the funds to an offshore bank in the Cayman Islands, a move so shady it practically screamed, "I have something to hide." I stared at the text message from Mark, a pit forming in my stomach. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. Not only had Ben taken the money that was meant for me, but he'd gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure I'd never find it. But there was something he hadn't counted on: the paper trail. As careful as Ben thought he was, every transaction left a digital fingerprint, and Mark was an expert at following them. "Leah's in on it, too," Mark said when I called him later that night. "What?" "I found a separate account in her name," he explained. "Looks like Ben funneled some of the money to her after it hit the offshore account. Not all of it, but enough to make her an accomplice." I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "How much?" "About $50,000, Mark said. The rest is still sitting offshore, untouched." I couldn't believe it. They hadn't just stolen my inheritance, they'd divided it up like vultures picking over a carcass. And they'd done it so casually, as if they had every right to take what wasn't theirs. I knew I needed to act fast. The longer I waited, the more time they had to cover their tracks. But I couldn't just confront them with what I'd found. Leah and Ben were skilled manipulators, and I had no doubt they'd try to twist the situation to make me look like the unreasonable one. I needed a plan. First, I contacted a lawyer, someone independent, someone Leah and Ben couldn't influence. Her name was Sarah Patel, and from the moment I stepped into her office, I knew I'd found the right person. She was sharp, confident, and unapologetically direct. "Your siblings are in violation of probate law," Sarah said after I laid out everything I'd uncovered. "If the will specifies an equal split, and they've taken more than their share, that's theft. Plain and simple." I nodded, trying to keep my emotions in check. "What about the investment account? The one Dad left for me?" "That complicates things," Sarah admitted. "If the account wasn't explicitly mentioned in the formal will, they'll argue it wasn't part of the estate. But," she added, holding up a finger, "your father's handwritten note could be key. It proves intent, and judges take that seriously." She leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes locking onto mine. "Are you ready to take this to court? Because once we file a claim, things are going to get ugly." I didn't hesitate. "I'm ready. Filing the claim was the first step. The second was making sure Leah and Ben couldn't wriggle out of it. To do that, I needed to bring their lies into the light, not just in court, but in the eyes of everyone who knew them. Leah, in particular, had built her entire life around appearances. Her social media was a carefully curated highlight reel, photos of her immaculate home, her smiling husband, her perfect little family. She loved being seen as the responsible, successful older sister. Ben was no different. He prided himself on being the level-headed one, the dependable rock of the family. If people knew what they'd done, their reputations would be destroyed. And I was going to make sure of it. The first thing I did was post anonymously on a local community forum, detailing the situation without naming names. I shared screenshots of the will and the bank transfers Mark had uncovered, making it clear that someone in my family had betrayed me. The post went viral almost immediately. People were outraged, calling the actions of my siblings despicable and urging me to fight back. Some even shared their own stories of inheritance disputes, which only fueled the fire. Next, I sent copies of the evidence to a local journalist who specialized in exposing financial fraud. Her name was Lisa Torres, and she had a reputation for being relentless. When I met with her in person, she didn't waste any time. "This is gold," she said, flipping through the documents I'd provided. "People eat this kind of story up, family betrayal, stolen money, the works. Are you okay with going public?" I hesitated for a moment. Once the story was out there, there'd be no going back. Leah and Ben would hate me for it, and any hope of reconciliation would be gone. But then I thought about Dad, about the trust he'd placed in me, about the promise I'd made to honor his wishes. "Do it," I said. The fallout was immediate. The article ran on the front page of the local paper under the headline, "Family Feud, Siblings Accused of Stealing Late Father's Inheritance." The story included everything, details from the will, the bank transfers, and even quotes from anonymous legal experts, courtesy of Sarah, who explained just how serious the situation was. Leah and Ben were furious. I found out through mutual friends that Leah had deleted all her social media accounts, unable to handle the flood of comments calling her a thief. Ben, on the other hand, tried to go on the offensive, claiming the article was full of misinformation and threatening to sue for defamation. But the damage was done. Their reputations were in shambles, and people who had once admired them were now avoiding them like the plague. The court date came faster than I expected. As I sat in the courtroom, staring across the aisle at Leah and Ben, I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a flicker of satisfaction. They wouldn't even look at me, their faces set in grim expressions. Sarah laid out our case with precision, presenting the will, Dad's handwritten note, and the evidence Mark had uncovered. Leah and Ben's lawyer tried to argue that the investment account wasn't part of the estate, but Sarah was ready for that. "Intent matters," she said, holding up the note. "Mr. Parker clearly intended for this account to go to his youngest daughter. My client's siblings unknowingly disregarded those wishes for their own financial gain." The judge didn't take long to deliberate. When he ruled in my favor, ordering Leah and Ben to pay back not only my share of the inheritance but also the full $150,000 from the investment account, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It wasn't just about the money. It was about justice. About making sure Leah and Ben couldn't get away with what they'd done. When the trial ended, I walked out of the courtroom feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Sarah shook my hand, congratulating me on the win, but her words barely registered. All I could think about was Dad, how he would have been proud of me for standing up for myself, for fighting for what was right. Leah and Ben didn't say a word as they left the courtroom, their heads bowed in defeat. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the baby of the family. I felt strong. But I wasn't done yet. Not entirely. There was still one final piece of justice I needed to deliver. After the court ruling, I thought it was over. I had won. The money was being returned, Leah and Ben's reputations were in tatters, and I had proved that Dad's wishes mattered. For a moment, I thought I could move on, that I could close this chapter of my life and start fresh. But life has a funny way of throwing curveballs, especially when you least expect them. 2 weeks after the trial, I got a call from Mark. I hadn't heard from him since the court case ended, so I assumed he was just checking in. But the tone of his voice immediately put me on edge. "Jenny, I found something else," he said. "What do you mean, something else?" I asked. "It's about the money," Mark said. "The offshore account, the transfers, something didn't add up, so I kept digging. And, well, you're not going to believe this." "What is it?" There was a pause, and then Mark said, "The money wasn't Dad's." I nearly dropped the phone. "What are you talking about?" "Of course it was Dad's. It was his investment account." "That's what I thought, too," Mark said, "but I traced the origins of the funds. The account was opened under Dad's name, but the deposits, they came from someone else." "Who?" Mark hesitated. "Your brother. Ben." I blinked, trying to process what he was saying. "You're telling me Ben put money into an account under Dad's name? Why would he do that?" "That's the thing," Mark continued. "It looks like he was funneling money from his job, large amounts, over several years. I think he was embezzling." The word hit me like a punch to the gut. Embezzling? Ben was a high-level executive at a prestigious company, the golden child of our family. He'd always been the one who acted like he had everything together, the responsible one. But now, Mark was telling me he'd been stealing from his own employer and hiding the money in Dad's name to cover his tracks. But why take it back after Dad died? I asked, my mind racing. "To erase the evidence," Mark said. "If anyone looked into the account and saw Dad's name, it could have led back to Ben. Closing it and transferring the money made it harder to trace." I sat down heavily, my heart pounding. If what Mark was saying was true, then this wasn't just about my inheritance anymore. This was something much bigger, and much darker. "What about Leah?" I asked. "Was she involved?" Mark sighed. "It's hard to say for sure, but based on the transfer to her account, she definitely knew about the money. Whether or not she knew it was stolen, that's another question." I thanked Mark and hung up, my mind spinning. I didn't want to believe it. As much as I hated what Leah and Ben had done to me, this was on another level. If Ben had been embezzling, and Leah had knowingly accepted stolen money, they weren't just greedy, they were criminals. I had a choice to make. I could let it go, take my inheritance, and walk away. Or I could take the information to the authorities and blow up their lives completely. I thought about Dad. He had always taught me to do the right thing, even when it was hard. But this wasn't just hard. This was devastating. Still, I couldn't ignore the truth. The next day, I made an anonymous tip to Ben's employer. I included all the evidence Mark had found, the deposits, the transfers, the offshore account. I didn't mention Leah by name, but I knew the investigation would uncover her involvement soon enough. Within a week, the story hit the news. Ben had been arrested for embezzlement, accused of stealing nearly $500,000 from his company over the course of 5 years. Leah wasn't named in the initial reports, but it didn't take long for her name to surface. The $50,000 transfer to her account was impossible to ignore, and soon she was facing charges as well, for receiving stolen property and aiding in the concealment of funds. The scandal rocked our entire family. Friends, neighbors, even distant relatives all had something to say. Leah and Ben went from being respected members of the community to social pariahs overnight. At first, I felt a sense of vindication. They had brought this on themselves. They had lied, cheated, and stolen, and now they were paying the price. But as the weeks went on, I started to feel empty. I had won. But at what cost? A month after the arrests, I got a call from Leah. It was the first time I'd heard from her since the trial, and I almost didn't answer. But curiosity got the better of me. "What do you want?" I asked coldly. Leah's voice was shaky, almost unrecognizable. "Jenny, why did you do this?" I clenched my jaw. "Are you seriously asking me that? You stole from me. You stole from Dad. And now you're mad because I didn't let you get away with it." "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. Ben told me the money was just a loan, that he'd pay it back before anyone noticed. I didn't know." "Don't lie to me, Leah," I snapped. "You knew exactly what you were doing." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Leah spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Dad knew." My blood ran cold. "What?" "About the money," Leah said. "About what Ben was doing. He found out a year before he died. He made Ben promise to stop, to come clean. But Ben, he didn't listen." I couldn't breathe. "Why didn't Dad say anything to me?" "He didn't want you to know," Leah said. "He didn't want you to get hurt. He thought if he kept quiet, Ben would fix it, and everything would be fine. But then Dad got sick, and everything spiraled out of control." I sat there in stunned silence, my mind racing. If Dad had known, if he'd tried to protect me, then this wasn't just about Leah and Ben betraying me. It was about them betraying him, too. In the end, Leah and Ben both took plea deals. Ben was sentenced to 5 years in prison, while Leah got 2 years of probation. The money was recovered, but it didn't feel like a victory anymore. I kept the inheritance, but it felt like blood money, tainted by everything that had happened. The house, the savings, even the $150,000 from the investment account, none of it could replace what I'd lost. Dad had trusted us to be a family, to take care of each other after he was gone. And instead, we'd torn each other apart. As I stood in the empty house one last time, packing up the last of Dad's belongings, I found myself looking at an old photo of the three of us, me, Leah, and Ben. We were kids then, smiling, carefree, and oblivious to the storms that would one day come between us. I wondered if we'd ever find our way back to those simpler times. But deep down, I knew the answer. Some betrayals can never be forgiven.